Thank you, Todd, and congratulations to all of the board members and those who just moved into new positions. And thank you for being here. My name is Stephanie Wolf. I'm no longer in the industry on a day-to-day basis. Having retired, I serve on 2 Deutsche Bank boards and as an advisor to 2 separate private companies. And I'd like to tell you a little more about this gentleman to my right, for those of you who don't know him, Ather Williams. Ather is a friend of mine and one of the best bosses I've had. So thank you for that, by the way. I learned how to be a little more strategic with you as a boss and a little less specific. But as Todd mentioned, Ather is in charge of, from an enterprise point of view, strategy, digital, innovation, and enterprise payments for Wells Fargo. He's based in New York, but he spends much of his life on a plane. And he is also responsible for the multi-million-dollar integrated payments and liquidity management business. Prior to joining Wells Fargo, I worked with Ather at Bank of America. Ather was responsible first for the global treasury management business, and following that, he was the president of business banking. Business banking is B of A's segment that covers small and medium-sized companies across the nation, approximately 30,000 of them, if memory serves. Ather has held other roles throughout his career, and he's received many accolades. Lest you think his full-time job is not enough, he serves on the board of Blue Shield of California, the Wells Fargo Foundation, and sits on a number of other leadership committees around the world. So we're going to talk today about our theme for the conference: innovate, collaborate, elevate. It seems as if technology allows us to do all 3. So I'd like to start, Ather, by asking you, how does Wells Fargo think of new technology and how to apply it?
Well, first of all, Stephanie, thank you for inviting me up here, and it's great to see you again. So when I think about technology, first of all, it's not one technology. We all get fixated, particularly because of the media cycle, on the latest thing. So, 2 years ago, it was generative AI, and every time I went anywhere, analysts, groups, people were talking about generative AI, and how is generative AI going to change payments? And I was like, it's not. We can go back in time and think about the convergence of technologies that have led to, truly led to industrial revolutions, and that's what we need to think about. So if you think about what happened in, call it the 4th industrial revolution around the internet, it wasn't just the invention of the World Wide Web, right? You needed the convergence of broadband, you needed mobile phones and the smartphone, the invention of the iPhone in 2007. The convergence of those things set off a revolution that kind of transformed a whole bunch of industries. When we think about, we at Wells, when we think about technology today, it's about the convergence of those things. So how do we think about the various forms of artificial intelligence creating systems that can do things for our customers? And so part of the challenge we all have is that AI today is moving so quickly that it's not really a technical problem, it's really a people problem. I mean, so if I ask all of you, how many of you are current on what AI agents can and can't do? So by a show of hands, how many people are current?
Seems a very small percentage.
Exactly. And that's the challenge. So when I think about what part of my job at Wells is not really spending time with Bridget Engel and the tech team. It's actually figuring out how to take the subject matter experts in the businesses, help them understand the potential of technology, and not take the technology and say, hey, let's apply it to this problem. You actually have to reinvent the entire thing. And so the metaphor I always use with our teams is like, if you think about electricity, something very simple. When electricity was introduced to manufacturing, everybody said, oh, great, I can add lights to the factory and add another shift of workers doing the same thing. Henry Ford took it and not only added lights to the factory, but also used electric machinery, and then created the conveyor belt and that systematic process for manufacturing a car, and dropped the price of the Model T, to something made very affordable. That's it's not only taking a convergence of technologies, but it's also rethinking the business process. And that's the thing I think we have to do when we at Wells are thinking about whether it's, first it was when I first got here, it was 5 years ago, it was digital. It was like, Wells Fargo was known for our branch network. We were known for 5,000 branches around the United States, and we wanted everybody to walk into a branch. Why? I have no idea. Because it's expensive and it's costly and there's high turnover in branches and it's not the thing. So how do we pivot to a digital first? That was less of a technical problem. Building the mobile app took us a year. Integrating it into the business processes so that you walk into a branch and walk out digitally enabled, and it doesn't take you 45 minutes to open an account. It can actually be done through the mobile app. That took cycles, not only of tech, but also of people. And so when you think about technology more broadly, across Wells, the second problem on this side of the house is thinking about what our customers are actually trying to achieve. And what technology do they have? I spend most of my time talking to CFOs and corporate treasurers. Most of them don't have very large tech budgets, as we all know. And they're working on legacy platforms. And it's interesting to think about, a $100 million Oracle installation as being a legacy platform, but it is. And the world we're living in, I actually was reading something on the train on the way down here last night. So Satya Nadella, CEO of Microsoft, said that 30% of his code today is generated through AI. Meta, next year, says that 50% of their code is going to be generated by AI. So think about what that does to your tech development cycles, for your clients and for you.
Much faster. Right,
much faster, much cheaper. It raises the quality of the code. And so then the question becomes, what's your role? I have entire teams building digital portals for middle market companies. Well, if you can self-generate code, at some point soon, you're going to be able to have an agent that any company can generate their own tech front end.
And it'll be much more bespoke.
Right.
So one more question on AI. We'll have multiple conversations during this conference on AI. Where do you see trends in applying AI to the business that most of the people in this room focus on: trade, payments, and liquidity?
Yeah, so let's take those.
Don't have to say state secrets. So
So I think the beauty of, when you think about AI systems, the beauty is they can deal with the data asymmetry that's sort of caused a lot of things not to move forward. So think about trade. And in a world today where trade barriers are going up, and whether or not you believe what's going on down the street is actually going to continue, the reality is it's creating more friction in the system, which is generally good for the industry. So
it doesn't feel that way right now.
No, not always. But look, we can have a different conversation about regulatory environments and what happens there. But in terms of trade barriers, those are complicated. They create a lot of uncertainty. That's not good. However, friction in trade does create opportunities for banks to play its natural intermediary role. However, you think about how cumbersome the trade process is, and we're not a huge trade bank, but we were a decent-sized trade bank in Bank of America. I also worked at JP Morgan, so understand the business fairly well. The ability for AI systems to actually not just go back to the old days of using optical character recognition and scanning documents and putting them in structured form, but actually be able to take structured data from ISO payments, unstructured data lifted out of documents, confirm and act. It actually creates smart contracts and drive forward things on an automated basis. Hugely impactful.
Absolutely. We all want that future. I know that you host an annual innovation summit at Wells Fargo. I was fortunate enough to be able to attend one year. And I'd like to ask you, how do you think about bringing third parties into your thinking about technology and innovation?
Yeah, so actually, Stephanie, I should have called you, because we actually just had 2 weeks ago, we split the conference into two. We now have one in New York as well.
Oh.
When you think about the tech community, it used to all be Silicon Valley based, but now there's a huge presence in New York. There's also a huge presence in London, but we're focused in New York. There we go. We'll schedule around Wimbledon. You'll be very happy. So third parties. So look, I think that going back to the prior statement about tech development, most entrepreneurs are so laser focused on a very minute problem that it never makes sense for us to think about building that. Like, we're not going to go build vertical solutions for every industry we serve. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So the way we've set up our tech infrastructure is we're thinking about it as a platform that's easy plug and play. Our AI platform can plug in any large language model, and based on what we're trying to do, we can plug it in, a new one comes out, we can unplug it, plug a new one in. We built the whole structure is being rebuilt around micro front-end technology. So everything is API-driven internally, connected to small services that we can reuse or plug out. And then we're pivoting our front-end strategy to be totally AI-driven. So let's go do the whole embedded payments, embedded finance thing. Let's plug into what's the best in breed for the client on the front end. We don't need to have them using our experience. The other thing that's changing around that is you think about how you bank. So I've got 3 college-age kids, and they don't navigate through our mobile app. They actually use Fargo and say, hey, Fargo, I want to send a Zelle payment to so-and-so, or I want to do this, or I want to do that. They do that. They don't Google anything. Everything is through ChatGPT or some other AI model they use. Basically, it's effectively like we used to use search. So when you think about that front-end experience, the agent is ultimately going to be the entry point. It's no longer going to be linear navigation, which is going to change a lot of things. So if you have, if you're a treasurer sitting at your desk and you've got an agent that can pull together versions of your cash forecast in real time based on all the different data streams you have coming in across your multiple banks, from your suppliers, internal sources, you can read ISDAs, you can do all that stuff in one place. That's going to completely change the game.
So you bring everybody together at the Innovation Summit, and literally every single CIO for every business is sitting on the stage taking questions from predominantly third parties who would very much like to be chosen. What factors go into the build versus buy? Capabilities, clearly, but any other concerns or opportunities?
Well, the first thing I think you have to do is, hopefully there's no CIOs in the room. You have to temper your engineers, right? Because engineers want to build everything. I can do it better. I can do it faster. Let me go do it. That's how they're wired. So you have to sort of temper their enthusiasm to go build everything. And we truly had to have a moment where we sat down and looked at what's our core competency. Like, what do we do on behalf of our clients? We should build that. We've all gone through or going through the ISO conversions. We'll never be on a vendor package ever again for payments, ever. That's a complete nightmare, being held hostage, and something we have to fundamentally do is take money in and move money out. So having that internal core competency has to be there. Front ends, or even things like sanction screening. Like, there's most people are on Microsoft, there's that. There's also a whole bunch of AI-driven technology that's better. And so being able to plug and play that stuff in and out is critical. But sanction screening is kind of I won't call it a commodity, but it kind of is. So understanding what your core competencies are and what are those commoditized services, buy the commoditized services, or buy the specialized services or lease them in those places that are moving very quickly. Because we know how this all works. You're going to spend a whole lot of cycles. You're going to build it. You're going to put it on the balance sheet. You have to amortize it. You're not going to change it out over a couple of years because the economics never work. The business leaders aren't going to want to change it because it's going to hit their P&L. So rent it.
I think you just made a number of third-party providers very happy, unless they're selling payment systems. So I know you said we could have a different conversation about regulations and government, but we have to have one little question given where we're sitting. What do you hope to see from government and regulators with respect to encouraging the adoption of innovation?
Well, I think first you need clarity and certainty. There's a lot of pulling back of regulation, but there's not a lot of clarity on what is and what isn't. So just think about basic stuff. Yeah, we can pull back on reputational risk. We're no longer in the U.S. going to examine the reputational risk. But no one's created clarity on what our role is around, know your customer and anti-money laundering law. So there's this gray area. So are you going to change your practices knowing you still may get dinged or sued? No. So that's going to change who you actually want to bank and how you want to engage with the broader ecosystem of money movement. The other thing we need is a level playing field. So we shouldn't have a world where crypto exchanges can do things that a bank cannot with lighter regulation and lighter capital. That's going to create, 2008, 2009 all over again. And so, our conversations through through the industry bodies we all participate in, or in our direct conversations with members of Congress and with the administration are about those two things. So we need clarity and certainty, and it should be codified in law of what you want us to do, what's the role. And secondly, we can't have a two-tiered system where crypto companies or fintechs in the historical sense or the traditional sense are allowed to do things that the banks are not, or allowed to do things with a less standard of care, certainty, structural integrity, and then that stuff falls back on the banking industry.
Which is how it's been to date.
Yes.
And I chuckle because Ather and I were together at a Sibos in Vienna in 2008 and had to immediately return to the United States to deal with everything that was going on. So those of you who were there, we don't want to relive it.
No, we do not.
So moving beyond the US borders, where in the world, because you have a global remit, do you see cutting edge technology being used effectively?
So I've always been, throughout my career, I always say that Asia has always been at the forefront. And I think there's probably a couple reasons for that. One is I think that many of the Asian countries, and right now I'm thinking specifically about like Singapore, or even India, who's come a long way over the 30 years I've been in this business, because there's a public-private partnership. And when I say that is like whether it's the National Payments Corporation of India or the broader Indian government will make some very clear thing. We're going to mandate we want real-time payments. We're going to mandate that people have a universal identifier, so we don't have to go through this whole kabuki dance with let's create EWS and let's create Zelle and let's have two real-time payment systems in the US and no one uses. And like all these things we have to sort of push through is challenging. So when you think about Asia, you're like, hey, Singaporean government decides, hey, I want to leverage blockchain to make to improve efficiency in trade finance. Pull together some banks, they take the regulators, they'll create the framework, they'll create a legal structure, and they'll say, let's go do it. Same thing in India around payments. China, obviously, what they did with WhatsApp has been pretty remarkable in sort of mandating things. So it's not necessarily that the technology is different. It's how things come together to make it work, because there's just so much friction. We also in the U.S. just have a lot of legacy payment systems candidly that work. You may not like the economics. Merchants may not like the economics of the card networks, but they forget about the history of why the card networks existed and why the card networks enable them to create some of the benefits they have today that are just sort of built into their economic models now, so they want more.
And I think cardholders forget the fact that when they're using a credit card, they have a degree of protection that they don't have in other systems.
That's very true. So, we have conversations at our senior operating committee all the time about, the push from our clients and others for pay by bank. And it's like, well, there's a whole set of things there that are a problem between economics and, the economics both for the bank, but also economics that cover things like returns and fraud and all that stuff that don't exist. So taking, peer-to-peer payments to the point of sale has a lot of challenges that people, when they peel it back, don't understand that, if a merchant's gonna take Venmo as an example, they're still getting charged, 3% to do that. There's economics if there's a problem. There isn't when it's Zelle and it's free.
Yes, and when we as users get to a point of sale and maybe we don't have Venmo, maybe we only have Zelle, to your point about multiple systems. Yes. So I think from a global perspective, I'm hearing clearly level playing field, and I'm hearing clarity on what the end goal is and the rules around how to achieve it.
Yeah, well, I also think that the clarity and certainty part also, when you think about what's going on in global trade today because of the current administration's stance on tariffs. It creates uncertainty. And what that does, it creates our clients who are corporations and behind them, their banks, stop spending. Like, no one's going to build a 30-year asset when they don't know what the trade policy is going to be in the next week.
Their payback is.
Right. So there's this freezing of activity that needs to, if we want to keep the economic engine flowing, we got to stop that. And so the certainty is part of that.
Thank you. My next question is something I know you're very passionate about. So new technology and innovation equals change. It does. In order to effectively approach change, you have to bring your own teams and your clients along because they have to adopt it. How do you do that? Change is hard.
Change is probably the hardest thing we have to do as a leadership team. When it comes to new technologies, first of all, it's candidly getting people to use it. So we've actually taken the top 250 people in the company who are basically, think about our senior team and our direct reports. And we're putting them through a series of training classes where we literally make them sit in a room and use the new technology. I remember back when we were at Bank of America, we actually did this with our board, where we're trying to explain to them the importance of digital. We made them sit down and download a bunch of apps and use them.
Didn't you have them use Warby Parker?
Yes.
Yeah. Back when nobody knew what Warby Parker was.
But to explain to them why this was transformative. And so you got to go get someone who's running a large trading business and make them sit down and actually use ChatGPT or use Google's new Gemini deep learning model and say, hey, I'm going to generate a 30-page research report in 4 minutes, and understand with references and data and everything else, and have them understand the impact of that. Because most people don't take the time, and they are kind of creatures of habit. You have to force them through that. Then it becomes a process where my innovation team comes in, where we have a whole team of people we've hired from the industry and also from places like Stanford Design Center, et cetera, or from IDEO, who do sessions on design thinking. So so now you understand, you have a subject matter expert, and you understand the potential of the technology. Now you have to come together and do a couple of 2-week sprints and really rethink the problem. The problem you're trying to solve, how can technology change it? And back to my point about Henry Ford, how do you then reinvent end-to-end? What's that look like? So if you take someone who does, syndicated loans for a living, and you introduce them to potential blockchain smart contracts and a little machine learning, and you say, well, would you do this today where you have 15 lawyers and 45 spreadsheets and you're tracking this stuff manually? And I've got payment operations, you're trying to fund these things and figure out who's, on what slate? No, you wouldn't do it that way. Would you do small business lending in the same way you do today? You wouldn't. You would actually say, there's a ton of private capital that doesn't have distribution. You've got lots of small businesses that don't have access to capital but are banked through all of us all around the world. You can match those two together in very different ways.
And what about on the client side? Because as much as it shocks me, and I'm sure all of your children, there's still a lot of checks being written in the United States, and we are, I'm told, getting rid of pennies, but there's still a lot of cash. How do you get the clients to change and maybe not pick up the phone? Become your kids.
Yeah, so checks.
I guess they can pick up the phone, but just talk to it.
Yeah, so checks are in the U.S., checks are the bane of my existence, right? Because the business I run operates lockboxes still. I never thought in 2025 we'd still have lockboxes, but we do. And we're modernizing them, which is just insane.
I won't tell you how I paid my taxes then.
Please don't. Hopefully involve a portal and a credit card or a direct,
Maybe not.
maybe a real-time payment.
Maybe a little piece of paper with a routing number.
Really?
I got to keep the post office in business.
Because California won't even take a check.
Well, not in, as you know, many states. I pay taxes many places, but yes, there is some electronic there.
Yeah, so checks are interesting, at least from my experience in the US. There's a couple, when you look at who writes checks, it's still businesses who are writing checks. So the number of checks being written has fallen. I think it's like down 10% year over year, something like that. And it's not necessarily consumers, even though, every time I go to the grocery store, there's always someone in front of me writing a check, and I'm just like, really? And then I tap my phone, and they're like, look at me like I'm from Mars, and you're like, okay. I always, it's probably cruel to say, but you're like, I always thought the generation who wrote checks is going to die before checks do. But there's still a thing. But the challenge on checks is getting people to change behavior. Like most businesses are like, it's easy. I don't have to store people's bank account information. I don't have to deal with, there's a perception that they get float, which is really not really the thing anymore. And it's an education problem. Because there's the promise of using request for payment over real-time payment rails that's going to get rid of checks. There's, virtual cards are going to get rid of checks. There's ACH direct debit supposed to get rid of checks. And none of it changes behavior. So part of what we've been pushing is how do you take the convergence of all that data and do it for them? Oh. And so to present it back to the client and say, here's a value proposition to make you switch off of checks. We have a thing, we have a product, just for one commercial, called Integrated Receivables that does that. It matches purchase orders, invoices, all that stuff using AI. And then you have to take that data and go back to the client and say, here's who paid you via check. Let's go push back to them and say how they can get them to do a different way and create some economics to make that happen.
And chances are, someone somewhere along the line just took a picture of the check and deposited it, so it didn't need to be there in the first place.
Exactly.
So help the client change behavior. So my last question for you, and I'm sorry we can't take audience questions. Those of us who know Ather are happy to take your questions and make sure they get to him, but he is flying to the West Coast today, so I want to make sure he gets there. So I know your alarm goes off many hours before mine, and I know that you are working out and you are reading something other than the most recent fiction book. But what do you suggest all of us do to prepare, as I know you do every day, for the new technology and innovation coming our way?
Yeah, so what Stephanie's alluding to, so my alarm clock goes off at 4:30. I'm in that crew. I get up at 4:30. I spend the first hour, after I feed my dogs, I have two dogs. I have a golden retriever and a Yorkie. Long story there, but Yorkie's my oldest daughter's dog. And he runs the house. But so I feed them at 4:30, and then I actually go up to my office in the house, and I spend the next hour reading. Start with traditional media, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times. If there's something new in The Economist, I'll check it out. And then I have a series of, whether it's on Slack or other medias where I look at sort of what's the latest going on in AI and what's the latest thinking. And actually, there's a CEO of an AI company who wrote an article yesterday saying that the reality is that most people the creators of these AI models, Sam Altman included, don't really understand how they work. Like, they can't understand why it predicts what it predicts, which is a challenge for all of us because we can't live in that world. So it does make you think about adoption in a different curve. You can't be in the Bill Gates, because he's a retired billionaire, that says that, hey, we're going to be at a 2-day work week in 10 years. We're not, because we need to understand how the technology works. But there's some great people. So one of the I had the opportunity to spend some time with a professor at University of Pennsylvania named Ethan Malik, who wrote a book called Co-Intelligence, and he has a series of blogs and things that he does. I would definitely recommend engaging with someone like Ethan or there's some great minds at Stanford and other places who are really pushing the edge. But I would say, read that, and then also just, believe it or not, go on the Reddit and see what the younger generation are actually using and doing. How are they engaging in technology? Because believe it or not, they're going to be our customers, whether they're consumers or they're, assistant treasurers very soon. I've got a 23-year-old who's graduating from college next week, and he's going into investment banking. But I know he's starting in investment banking in a world where he had artificial intelligence for his entire college career. So how he uses technology is very different than I did when it was Lotus 1, 2, 3, when I started out, very different. And the things that they can do and the speed with which they can get information and the types of information is going to change things. And so understanding how they're thinking about using technology and what they want technology to do is going to drive it, because now also remember that same group of people are going to have agents that can generate code. So they're going to be writing their own technology. And now you're in this weird, interesting loop of the limits of technology become really the limits of the user, because the barrier to not being able to code the latest language is no longer there.
Like you said, it comes down to the people.
Yes.
Ather, thank you. Thank you for coming here to be with us. I hope you'll join us at some future conference. And round of applause.